The career and contributions of our friend William Julius Wilson. I should start by noting that some people use this word to characterize this event, that it's an R word and ends in T. And as I've told Bill and many others, I never use the word retirement. I think of Bill as stepping away from teaching informal committee assignments. But we have absolutely no intention of letting him retire. Spoken like a former dean. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning session and to introduce a friend and colleague and collaborator in this event, Douglas Elmendorf, the dean, and Don K. Price Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Those of you who know him know he served as a Brookings Fellow, as director of the Congressional Budget Office before coming here, a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and has really been a full-hearted collaborator in pulling together this event for us to kind of savor and reflect upon and extend into a long future the work of our friend and colleague William Julius Wilson. So without further ado, let me welcome Dean Elmendorf to the stage.
The background. Thank you.
Of course. Well, good morning, everyone. I am honored to be able to play this small part in our celebration of our extraordinary colleague and friend, William Julius Wilson. Indeed, I'm honored to have been Bill's colleague for these past few years, and I look forward to being Bill's colleague for many years to come. I agree precisely with Larry Bobo. You can add the word emeritus to your title, Bill, but we're not going to let you get away very easily. The Kennedy School has been so proud to claim Bill as a member of our faculty for the past 20-plus years. And more importantly, the Kennedy School's intellectual life and impact on social policy has been greatly elevated by Bill's presence among us for these past 20-plus years. No roll call of the greatest members of the Kennedy School faculty, which is an impressive roll call, would be complete without Bill. Bill has mattered so much to our school, to this university, and to the country. I've been so impressed and moved, Bill, to hear the stories of the past few days of the many people so distinguished in their own right who trace their career paths to you, to your personal involvement, to your work, which has helped to guide them. Many of you in this room have had a chance to know Bill for much longer than I have and to work with Bill more closely than I've had that chance. So I'm going to speak only briefly, and then I will cede to the first panel of the day. The main point I want to make is simply that Bill Wilson reflects the highest ideals of the Kennedy School. He is both a profoundly deep and innovative scholar and an intensely committed an important contributor to policy discussions. Few people have mattered as much in either of those ways as Bill, much less in both respects at the same time. And I want to describe one example of this combination. I recently read a lecture that Bill gave at the Kennedy School more than 30 years ago. The Edwin L. Godkin Lecture was established at Harvard in 1903. The lecture is intended to address, quote, the essentials of free government and the duties of the citizen, unquote. So over time, the Kennedy School became the home for the Godkin Lecture. In 1988, Bill was a professor at the University of Chicago, as you know, and he was invited to give the Godkin Lecture. This was just after the publication of his acclaimed book, The Truly Disadvantaged. And Bill titled his lecture, The American Underclass, Inner City Ghettos and the Norms of Citizenship. I think a number of you may have been present for that lecture. And although I was on the Harvard campus at the time, I was not at the lecture, which I regret. I was rereading Bill's words a few weeks ago, and I was struck by two aspects of this Godkin lecture he gave. One was his incredibly incisive review of the scholarly research at the time on race and class and poverty. And as you go through the lecture, he assembled piece by careful piece, a puzzle, drawing together these disparate strands of research. He placed each piece with such care and precision so that by the end, the listeners would understand the subtle but very consequential differences between different sorts of results and what they meant for our understanding of the world. And you could see in those parts of this lecture the mind of a truly great scholar at work. But I was also struck, as I read the lecture, by Bill's focus on how people outside the world of scholarship were interpreting or misinterpreting or ignoring this research. Bill spoke repeatedly about, quote, popular views, the views of journalists and book writers and policymakers and the general public. And sometimes, fairly enough, he spoke with frustration, noting at one point, quote, apparently rigorous scientific argument is no match for the dominant belief system. But mostly, Bill spoke with hope that his research and others' research explained clearly and perhaps repeatedly could improve popular understanding and could lead to more effective policymaking. One could see in these parts of Bill's speech a true commitment to bringing the research that he and others were doing to bear on the most important issues of that time and indeed of our time. And it is this combination of scholarship and service, this tackling of vital problems with rigor, and then engaging fully in the public discourse and in policymaking that the Kennedy School stands for. And one can see in Bill's Godkin lecture and in so much of his work over the years why he has stood for and represented for many of us the best that the Kennedy School can aspire to be in the world. Indeed, when John Kennedy spoke at Harvard's commencement in 1956, then Senator Kennedy said, quote, the intellectuals who can draw upon their rational, disinterested approach and their fund of learning to help reshape our political life can make a tremendous contribution to their society while gaining new respect for the group of intellectuals. Bill is exactly the sort of intellectual whom John Kennedy seems to have been seeking. At the time of the Godkin lecture, as I noted, Bill was a professor at the University of Chicago. He was introduced for the Godkin lecture by then Harvard president Derek Bok. And Derek spoke about Bill somewhat presciently. He said, and I quote, Dr. Wilson is probably on closer personal terms with more major university presidents than almost any other professor in the United States. For all of them, at one time or another, and frequently more than once, have engaged in an unsuccessful attempt to woo him away from Chicago, unquote. Very fortunately for all of us, and as Skip and others have described, Harvard ultimately succeeded in luring Bill away and to draw him here, where we have been so lucky to have him as a colleague. One might also observe that Bill might be on closer personal terms with more US presidents and policymakers than almost anybody else. And the wonderful video from President Clinton that you showed, Skip, the opening night, I think is one testament to that. But all of these, all this interest in drawing Bill by scholars and by practitioners just shows how crucial Bill's work has been. And Derek Bok credited Bill in another way in his introduction to the Godkin lecture. Derek said, and again I quote, I don't know how many people in the audience stopped to think how difficult the issue on which Bill is working really is for a scholar. It's not only very hard intellectually, it is also a field filled with the most intense political and emotional pressures. It is Bill's great achievement, among others, that he has always kept his own counsel, spoken his own mind, maintained his scholarly integrity to this vitally important subject, unquote. Bill, we are so grateful for your incredible scholarly skill and integrity and for your commitment to the public interest. Harvard has been a much better and more interesting place these past 20 plus years because you are here, and we look forward to many more years working with you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tommie Shelby. I'm a philosophy professor and also the chair of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies here at Harvard. And it is of my honor to chair this panel this morning on political framing, public policy, and political coalitions. But before I get to those duties, I'd like to just take a moment to say a few words about Bill, if you'll allow me, even if it manages to echo and re-echo some things other people have said. Skip has already said far more eloquently and more powerfully than I could even imagine, actually, about what Bill has meant to the Department of African and African American Studies, so I won't take my time to speak on behalf of the department, but instead I'll say just a few words about what Bill and his work has meant to me personally. Actually, my first encounter with Bill's work was actually in graduate school in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. At the time, almost all the black intellectuals and scholars, graduate students that I knew were thinking about issues of race regarded Bill's book, Declining Significance of Race, as in effect a piece of neoconservative propaganda. I was fairly confident that those people had not read the book. I'm a philosopher by training and temperament, so it is, of course, I was disposed to consider that a heretical idea and pretty open to having my basic convictions challenged. So, of course, I did read the book. And, my response was actually not unlike Glenn Lowry's. Right? That is that I was like, this is a neo-Marxist text. But unlike Glenn, I think, he'll correct me, for me, this was actually a welcome discovery. So later when I get to know Bill and I described the book in that way, he sort of gently corrected me. Actually, I'm a neo-Weberian. So, so I had to take that back. But I still strikes me that way. In any case, I found the focus on class, on labor, on political economy really quite refreshing and instructive. It's a book that kind of drew my attention to the work of the great sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox, and his book, not read as much as it should be, Caste, Class, and Race, a book I've used in a number of courses that I've taught, and a lot of that was due to Bill's engagement with it. But the main thing I took away from that first encounter with Bill's work and the controversy that surrounded it is really a model of intellectual engagement. As others have noted, Bill exhibits sort of great independence of mind and courage, even daring in his work. It's really quite an exemplar of intellectual integrity and a moral seriousness. He follows the arguments and the evidence wherever it goes. Even when this means breaking sharply with his fellow black progressives. And this is one of the things I most admire about the man and his work. Another thing I greatly respect about Bill's work is his long-standing focus on the interplay between race and class. Like the great Du Bois, Bill wrestled with the complex relationship between racial domination and exclusion on the one hand, and economic exploitation and marginalization on the other. And this sort of race-class nexus has been like my singular preoccupation in my own work, and really studying Bill's writings have been enormously helpful on my own thinking. And in particular, one finds in Bill's writings serious attention to the differing life prospects between the black middle class and the black poor. One of the unfortunate things about a lot of racial discourse today is that it fails to take seriously class differentiation among blacks. And I think Bill's work on this issue has really quite far-reaching implications for our understanding of black politics and for the various challenges that it has for thinking about black solidarity and coalition building, some of the things I think we'll be talking about on this panel. And it's really sort of Bill's way of framing that set of issues that shaped a lot of the work I did in my first book, thinking about black solidarity and the challenges of our contemporary moment for thinking about black politics. Books like The Declining Significance of Race and The Truly Disadvantaged are, as many of you know, they're classics and canonical texts in the multidisciplinary field of African American studies. And Bill's had most of what we've heard from and will hear from are people in history and in the social sciences and the policy world, but of course Bill's work reaches beyond that into the broader humanities, including in the typically rarefied world of philosophy, where I hail from, and including what some would call, I sometimes call even black philosophy. And one of the early engagements by philosophers with Bill's work is a book from 1992 called The Underclass Question. This was edited by the philosopher Bill Dawson. Our own Cornel West wrote the epilogue for that book, entitled Philosophy in the Urban Underclass. And Bill himself wrote the foreword. In that volume, you had a set of quite talented and distinguished black philosophers engaging this influential book, Truly Disadvantaged. And this is just one example, one could give many, of the perhaps unexpected reach of Bill's work outside of the areas where people mostly think of it. When I became Bill's colleague at Harvard in 2000, he quite kindly and generously, as others have noted, became a kind of personal guide to the relevant literature in sociology. He was always my first stop, what should I read on this? And Bill gives you a list and tells you, you got to read this, you got to read that, and so on. And really it was that guidance that really made my book, Dark Ghettos, possible. And that book, in a lot of ways, I sometimes describe it, was an attempt to try to take the concerns that philosophers like, say, John Rawls had in thinking about justice, societal justice, and put that in conversation with the questions that Bill has been engaging over many years, the sociological and policy concerns that were his occupation. Though, of course, I sprinkled a little bit of Huey Newton and Nas in there, too, but you know what I mean. And in addition to engagement with political philosophers, the endnotes of my book are really full of citations of the distinguished scholars who've been presenting at this symposium. And I can tell you, that's because Bill told me to read you. It's like, you need to read this person, and they're all here, and it's like amazing to listen to you all and go back over the many conversations we had about, including sitting in on Bill's Race and Culture seminar as he taught many of you who've been presenting here today. Let me say just one last thing about Bill. As many of you know, in 2001, the Department of Afro-American Studies went through a kind of highly public crisis. And this included the departure of Anthony Appiah and Cornel West. We've probably gone, these two philosophers were a big part of the reason, probably the main reason that I wanted to come to Harvard. And so this was quite a devastating result. And their exit made me feel in a lot of ways quite depressed and isolated in a lot of ways. And I was actually seriously considering applying for jobs elsewhere. And during this sort of challenging time, Bill often does, took me to dinner. And at that dinner, he was encouraging, as always, gently paternal, generous. And he kind of helped me to see the possibilities, what I might be able to achieve, what I might be able to do if I were to remain here at Harvard, despite the fact that my two philosophy colleagues had left. And of course, I believe he was right about that. I'm sure I couldn't have done the work I'm most proud of having done if I hadn't remained here. But what I want to emphasize is that I don't think I could have done that work without Bill. So I'd like to take the opportunity just publicly to say thank you to you for your outstanding scholarship, for your unique example, as others have noted, and for your invaluable mentorship. Greatly miss you as a colleague. So let me turn to briefly introduce our panelists. As some of you probably have noticed, Michael Dawson is not here, was unable to join. But I'll introduce our other panelists in the order in which they'll speak. Quite a distinguished lot, as you know. The program has detailed information about their many accomplishments, so I'll be really brief. Robert Greenstein is the founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He's, of course, an expert on anti-poverty programs, and he received the 2008 Heinz Award for Public Policy and the 2010 Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize from the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Greenstein was administrator of the Food and Nutrition Service, of the Food and Nutrition Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture under President Carter. He was also appointed by President Bill Clinton in 1994 to serve on a bipartisan commission on entitlement and tax reform. And he headed the federal budget policy component of the transition team for President Obama. Theda Skocpol is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology here at Harvard. Skocpol is a prolific and highly influential scholar, recipient of many awards and honors, and including one award in political science, a Swedish word that I actually cannot pronounce. Say, there you go.
You have to get it to pronounce it.
There you go. That's great. She writes on a wide range of subjects and an author of numerous books, including States and Social Revolutions, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, and one of the more recent books, The Tea Party and Remaking Republican Conservatism. Margaret Weir is professor of political science and international and public affairs at Brown University, although hailed from for quite a while in Berkeley, as I recall. Her research centers on social policy, poverty, and urban politics in the United States and in Europe. She's also the author and editor of several books, including Schooling for All, Race, Class, and the Decline of the Democratic Ideals, written with Ira Katznelson, and Politics and Jobs, The Boundaries of Employment Policy in the United States. So please, this morning, let's welcome this quite distinguished panel, and let's look forward to what they have to say.
Morning. A number of people have talked about Bill's amazing contributions to scholarship. I'd like to, like Doug did, talk more about his contributions to policy and policy debates. I want to start with the debate over, so is the welfare state to blame for the conditions in the inner cities? Let's think back to 1984. In 1984, an earthquake occurred in policy debates when Charles Murray's Losing Ground came out. It captured parts of the media, pundits, policy debates by storm. It was being discussed everywhere. It quickly was infused into policy debates, particularly in Washington. And of course, at the core of Murray's bottom line was his cut the Gordian knot, eliminate much or all of the welfare state. Now, pretty quickly, critiques of the book began to appear. And there was one, to me, that stood out in late '84, written by a young economist I hadn't known or met before, that skewered Murray's misuse of the research and the data. It was by a young guy I hadn't met before named David Ellwood. I followed along similar lines, not at the level of excellence of David's, with an article in the New Republic. But frankly, David's piece, my piece, and others fell short in a key respect. To some people, they seemed a little technical or technocratic. We pulled apart things that weren't, from a statistical standpoint or an analytical standpoint, really kosher in what Murray was doing. But Murray had offered this beguiling framework explaining the world. Where was the alternative, more compelling framework? About 3 years later, in 1987, one day I got a phone call that surprised me. On the phone, they said, hey, this is, we're calling from the New York Times Sunday Book Review. We'd like you to review this new book, not out yet, we'll send you an advance copy, called The Truly Disadvantaged by William Julius Wilson. I had not been familiar with Bill or read his earlier work. And they said, oh, by the way, you got several thousand words. We think this is an important book. We're thinking of putting the review on page 1 of the Sunday Book Review. Okay? So I got the advance copy, and I just started to read. I'm going to write the review. I'm curious. I'm interested. Well, within a few pages, it wasn't curiosity and interest. It was captivation. And then excitement. And by the time I was halfway through the book, I felt like my mind was exploding. Really, so much in one book. So compelling. It really was quite extraordinary. I remember in the latter parts of the book feeling almost physical excitement as I kept reading more and more of the book. Now, as you all know, among the key elements of the book was Bill's really strong emphasis on the central role of labor markets, the changes in labor markets in inner cities, the adverse effects they had had, and his call for tight labor markets as a critical ingredient of making progress. Bill's work really then began to permeate policy discussions, both the truly disadvantaged and other work. I can tell you as someone who works on these issues in Washington, more and more and more it would seep into the debate. It would seep into the discussions. It would change the shape and the nature of the debates. It opened up new ground. It had increasing and ultimately profound effects. Let me give you two examples. Prior to the 1990s, or even the late 90s, Federal Reserve and other policymakers were nervous, reluctant about letting unemployment rates fall below 5% or even often 5.5%. Yes, everyone understood that lower unemployment rates meant more jobs, and there was, it wasn't mysterious that lower unemployment rates were particularly important for people of color. But the importance of tight labor markets, particularly for people of color, it just didn't have that much weight. It just wasn't like such a central element in how you should think about monetary and broader employment policy. Now look at today, or even go back to the late 90s. The Fed let unemployment fall to 4%. Today it's, I think, 3.7%. Let me be clear. I'm not want to be too simplistic here. There are lots of factors that have led to that change in policy. Lower interest rates, developments in both the national and changes in the international economy, the conditions that Larry Summers calls secular stagnation. But when you get big changes like this, there's almost never one element. There are a series of threads that working together, even though they're coming from different places, change the shape of the debate. And Bill's work and the change it made and the focus on tight labor markets, particularly for inner cities, particularly for people of color, is, in my view, one of the important threads that has led to this very important change in the policy atmosphere. Now, as the second example, let me return to Charles Murray. So again, recall that at that point in the mid-'80s, after his book, and Ronald Reagan was president, the threats of significant cutbacks in key safety net programs was large. Bill not only rejected Murray's call and provided an alternative framework that has really stood the test of time, as we've heard the last 2 days, unlike Murray's, which I won't say more. In 1991, in the book published by Brookings called The Urban Underclass, there's a chapter by Bill, very important chapter. I just reread it a couple days ago and was struck by how important it still is these years later. And in that chapter, Bill closed it with a clarion call for stronger policies and programs to improve the lives of disadvantaged groups through, and I quote from Bill's chapter, a combination of targeted and universal approaches that are race neutral. I can tell you that Bill's work, the framework, the policy direction, became a foundation, a guidepost for people like myself, my group, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and a number of others. What are the key things to push for? What should be our priorities? How do we think about all of this? I often say, in talking to new staff at our center, a lot of our work is inspired by the vision of William Julius Wilson. And what happened? Well, on the negative side, as Kathy Eden so well described yesterday, cash welfare has largely collapsed. I'd argue that that's not so surprising, given that the old cash welfare programs were very narrowly targeted, largely on people who weren't working, and were successfully portrayed and demonized as for those people. But in many other areas, the safety net, oh, and I would say the answer there is not to go back to the old welfare programs, I think, but to make the child tax credit fully refundable, kind of a child allowance. More on that in a minute. But as a whole, the safety net greatly expanded for people with lower modest incomes, with much larger numbers of people gaining, often very substantially, as a result of really large expansions in Medicaid, the creation and expansion of the Children's Health Insurance Program, huge expansions in the Earned Income Credit, very large expansions in SNAP, what we used to call food stamps. And look at the data. Around 1970, using the broader measure of poverty that counts non-cash income, safety net as a whole lifted out of poverty 5% of people who would otherwise be poor. Today, it lifts out of poverty over 40% of people who would otherwise be poor. These expansions of these programs that led to that result have in common that virtually all of them combine the poor with the near poor, and some or all of the lower middle class, and they're race neutral in their eligibility criteria, but they disproportionately benefit people of color. In short, they follow the lines, the call, the vision that Bill laid out. And there could be more to come. A little bit of good news, not what I'm usually known for. In April of this year, Senators Bennett and Brown introduced a bill, misnamed the Working Families Tax Relief Act, that would make the child tax credit fully refundable, greatly expand the Earned Income Credit for workers not raising children at home, and lower the age of eligibility for it from 25 to 19 to bring in those young people newly entering the labor market, often in conditional or part-time or very low-wage jobs, and also increase the EITC for families with kids by a quarter. The data show it would lift 29 million people out of poverty or closer to the poverty line, including 11 million children, cut the child poverty rate by a quarter, and cut the rate of children living below half the poverty line by nearly 40%. And it's not just pie in the sky. Of the 47 Senate Democrats, 46 are co-sponsors. And the Ways and Means Committee in the House has taken a few pieces of it and already passed them. Now, it's not going to be enacted this year. It's not going to be enacted next year. Depending on the outcome of the election in 2021, there's a real possibility there. So let me conclude. Bill's contributions, to me, they're one of the words that comes to mind. Bill's contributions have been monumental, not only to scholarship, not only to inspiring volumes of critically important research, not only to training, mentoring, and developing generations of students and researchers, but also to actual policy changes that have improved the lives of millions of people. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay, well, it's an honor to be here this morning to celebrate Bill's life and career and his continuing and future contributions, and to be with all of you. Let me just hit the bottom line. I see a lot of my career as having tried to fill in the political part of the political economy that Bill Wilson so masterfully laid out in his early books. And I'll talk about them in a minute. What I'd like to do today is to ask whether the framework laid out in The Declining Significance of Race and Bill's call in The Truly Disadvantaged for universal along with targeted public policies, whether that analysis, both of the sweep of American history, race and class across the eras of American history, and the vision of a political coalition and a policy approach still holds today in the era of Obama and the Trump reaction against Obama. Because I think, as many of you know, there are plenty of people who would say, that's all gone, and we need a completely different analysis and approach. Before I proceed, let me just say that my bottom line is going to be that it does still hold today if we have a better understanding of how the political ground has shifted since Bill's crystallized this analysis in the 1980s. I'm just going to briefly say that Bill's impact on me was most vivid in the University of Chicago era. The minute that Harvard denied me tenure, Bill was on the phone, and I was in Chicago the next day. He was unremitting in his courtship and persuaded me, along with Ira Katz-Nelson, to go to the University of Chicago in what I think of as a scintillating period, at least in my life, and I hope in all of our lives. It didn't last long. Ira left for New York, and Bill eventually came back to Harvard. I guess I came back first, but wasn't really accepted here when I first got back. So my memories are all of the University of Chicago period, even though I know he's been here for a long time. Those of you who know the two universities will understand that faculty members interact much more at the University of Chicago than they do at Harvard University. That's something about what makes Chicago so special. And very quickly, I can remember many times of personal interactions with Bill and his family at that time as I lived alone in a commuting relationship. My husband was in New Jersey. So it was not just intellectual, but also personal, the outreach in that period. The wonderful workshops where we blended political science and sociology at the Center for Industrial Societies. Margaret was part of that. Bulls games. We went to Bulls games, and I don't even like basketball. But there we were. And finally, the University of Chicago's students would have wonderful skits every spring to make fun of the faculty members. And the one I remember with greatest pleasure about Bill was when they had the Lucy Flower Distinguished Service Professor, and they had a Bill, very prim and proper in a suit, arriving in a ghetto neighborhood and announcing, "I'm the Lucy Flower Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and I'm here to study you." So that was great. All right, so on with the business at hand. Because apart from these personal memories that are very important and informative in my career, Bill's work and scholarship has been an important intellectual touch point for me throughout my career. And I will have to say, he was portrayed last night as always kind, supportive, and rigorous, and that's true. But in fact, what's so important, I think, for young people to see today is the way he combines dispassionate commitment to objective scholarship and respect for everyone in an argument, even people he really disagrees with passion about the subject. But when he gets into an argument, he's tough. And The works under discussion here, particularly the declining significance of race, the very title, which many people never got beyond, and the argument for universal as well as targeted public policies, race neutral, really angered a lot of people back in the 70s and 80s. And some of them, you know,